to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. I am your host, Sandy Lowres, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast is proudly brought to us by the award-winning platform WB40, Women Beyond 40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond who have no more F's to give and want to talk about the important stuff. You can check us out at wb40.com. Before I begin today's podcast, I would like to recognise the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded and where I live and play. And in my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my deep respects to their elders, past, present, and those emerging. I would also like to pay homage to their ancient history as storytellers. Today in the podcast, I'm fangirling a little bit about my next guest, and she's pretty incredible. She is synonymous with producing in television in Australia, and deservedly so, because there's probably nothing that she hasn't done in this realm. I am talking about the incredible and amazing Anita Jacoby, who has gone beyond her extraordinary career producing shows such as 60 Minutes, morning television, Enough Rope with Andrew Denton, the list goes on and on, to write a book basically about things that she found out about a parent. This is an incredible book called Secrets Beyond the Screen. It's really a book about things she discovered about her dad after he passed away. It's a powerful book, but Anita Jacoby really is a legend in this country, in television and in print media. I certainly am fangirling. I cannot wait for you to hear her story and her extraordinary wisdom. Please welcome to the Confessional, Anita Jacoby.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly!
Hi, Anita, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional. How are you today?
Oh, Sandy, I'm great. What's not to like? I'm sitting opposite you and about to have a great chat.
Oh, you are fabulous.
And
I
I've
will.
got to say thank you for having me. That's what I really should have said. So I appreciate it.
Look, thank you so much for joining me today, because I'm absolutely thrilled. I am a huge fan of everything that you do and, have done, continue to do. You're really extraordinary, and there's so much today that I want to talk to you about, because you've had...
Thank you. Thank you. I feel a little bit blown away, but thank you very much for your comments.
Oh, you've had this extraordinary career, I have to say, and it's pretty enviable, and have won a lot of awards and accolades for the work that you have done. And, for obvious reasons, it's quite extraordinary. I guess, I really want to talk to you today about your amazing book, which is called Secrets Beyond the Screen. But I guess before we get to that, I would really love everyone to hear a little bit more about your stellar career in both print and television media. It's quite extraordinary. So let's start out, I guess, how it all started for you, because interestingly, you studied economics at university and somehow end up in television. So how did that all happen?
That did. Look, I was never a terribly good student from day one. I mean, I actually, even when I was in high school, I got into an enormous amount of trouble and got thrown out of a private girls' school here in Sydney, which was, not something that I'm particularly proud of now. And in fact, I've never been invited back really to that school, but as it is. So as you said, I did leave school, and I went on I actually wanted to do economics law, but I really didn't apply myself enough to do law. Law is very similar to journalism when you think about it. A lot of journalists, go into law before they become journalists. But I always wanted to be a journalist. And so I got an opportunity initially when I was at university to actually go and work for a publishing company called Paul Hamlin's. And I started out very much at a time and very young as a marketing trainee. But because my English was reasonably good, I got moved into editorial at quite a young age and began to learn what editing was about and working in publishing. And I was easily the youngest person there, but I learned with some really creative and outlandish people who actually meant that when I finally got into television, I could handle anything because I'd started with some really interesting people at such a young age. So that's how I got started, and moved on from there.
Wow, incredible. Nowadays, I suppose it's a much harder kind of thing, I guess, to get into television production. But for you, how did television come about? Like you worked on some pretty big television programs, really. So early 80s, and
Yes.
how did you feel about getting into television?
Look, I loved it. I actually, after publishing, landed a job when Ita Buttrose was the editor of the Women's Weekly, and it was all women. That's about the only time in my career I've had a female, or one of the few times I've had a female boss. And I worked with Ita at the Women's Weekly, and then an opportunity came up at Simon Townsend's Wonderworld, which was a kids show, but it was really more directed at adults. I don't know if you recall it. It was Monday to Friday. It was in the afternoons. It was like a kind of kids current affairs show. And that was the most extraordinary experience on many levels, mainly because there were only two of us researching and writing up to 11 reports a week, finding all those stories, coming up with music, locations, the talent to tell those stories. It's what I would traditionally call a sweatshop. So I really learned quite early on about television and threw myself into that. But then what I decided was I really wanted to go into news. So I kept knocking on doors to try and get a job as a reporter and tell news, because that's a great passion of mine, news and current affairs. And I managed to get an opportunity at one of those regional areas, which was Newcastle. And that was a great training ground for television and for just being thrown into chief of staff roles in a newsroom, going out and reporting on stories, everything from fires to fatal accidents to, the breakdown of the BHP in Newcastle. And at a young age, you really started learning the nuts and bolts of storytelling and television making. And that was a great training ground for me. And I
Yeah,
recommend it for anybody listening to this if they're interested in getting into television, that rural areas is often a great way to start.
oh, that's brilliant advice, actually. Um, yeah, interesting. I will say that I do very much remember Simon Townsend's Wonderworld when I was in high school, and I remember coming home. It was always on in the afternoon when you got home
Mm,
from school, right?
yeah.
Quite amazing. And I guess I'm interested to know what that dynamic was like because Simon Townsend was so huge at the time. What was he like to work with?
So you're right. It was a huge program. It probably gets lost in the distance of time. The program won 5 Logies and numerous other awards, and it was so popular. And it was the training ground for people like Amanda Keller, who of course we all know, Angela Concerns, who was in radio, Jonathan Coleman, who was on 10. All these really, really talented people at a very young age. Simon is and was an interesting character to work with. I guess he was very creative. He actually created this show, and I applaud him for doing that. But often in organisations, the culture can be the wrong kind of culture. And I found it very much like a sweatshop. I don't think we as young people were treated as well as we should have been. And that taught me a lot about how you manage people and how you create a culture that is acceptable for people, not just young people, for any people to work in. So probably in reflection, there was stuff that I think should have been done differently at that time. But as you rightly said, it was the early 1980s. And I think those kind of issues with the way that you treated staff and cultures were really not on your agenda. It was actually just making programs and kicking goals and winning. That's really what it was all about. And that was the culture that I grew up in.
Yeah, wow. It's a good, as tough as that must have been, and I'm sure it was, I feel like in a way, did it kind of set you on a path for understanding how much hard work would be ahead of you and cutting your teeth, I guess, in really difficult circumstances?
Yes, I think it did because I had to perform 24/7. You were constantly coming up with ideas, because there were only two researchers and writers on that show. And as I said earlier, we were doing 11 stories a week each. And that's an enormous amount. I mean, you're generating 5 half hours of content per week. And it was relentless. And the burnout on doing that was really high. I lasted a year, which was probably more than most researchers and writers lasted. But what it did was it honed my thinking, and it honed me the way that I thought about ideas, and that everybody has ideas, and that you need to look more broadly and actually sort of think laterally about how you can make an idea. And I moved from Simon Townsend's Wonderworld into news. But then what I did was, along with a very influential woman who I'd worked with, Helen Grasswell, we created a show for Channel 7, and we actually sold it to Channel 7. I think I was 23 or 24. At those days, I didn't really know what I was doing. But what I knew was I could actually, again, come up with ideas, find the people to tell those ideas, and actually create content and create a show. And we did create this show that was on the 7 network. It went up against two of the biggest shows in the world. In the world. One was MASH, which was the biggest show of the world. And the other one was the biggest show in Australia, which was Sale of the Century on the 9 network. So again, we were learning on the road, and we were just kind of applying the skills that we'd learned back at Simon Townsend's Wonderworld, that I'd learnt on the road as a news reporter, and creating something that was really quite something. So I still look back at that and think, I don't know how we did it, but we did. And I learned a lot in those days about making television from a very young age.
Yeah, wow. I'm kind of fascinated as well because you, like 23, I can't even begin to fathom how that was. Some of the most magical things in life, I think, happen when we're not thinking about it. Like if you knew what laid ahead, maybe you wouldn't have made some of the choices that you made, because then you get nervous and then you start to
Yes.
doubt yourself, right?
Yeah,
So at
yes.
23, how magical that you pulled that off.
But I would say to you, Sandy, I happen to have and I know we'll talk about the book later, but I happen to have a parent, a father, who really from a very young age empowered me and made me believe that I was confident and capable of doing anything, and that I had the courage to do that. And I think when a parent is so empowering at such a young age, that actually shapes the way you are for the rest of your life. I mean, sure, it doesn't mean that I haven't had some incredible hurdles, and I've dealt, and I've actually sort of come up against walls that are almost insurmountable. But I've always felt like had the capacity to do what I was doing. And so to sell a show at 23 to the managing director of the 7 network and get that up and running, I mean, that was also, I did it with Helen. I didn't do it alone. I had somebody who was very, we worked together. So we were a really strong, powerful duo and felt very confident in what we were doing. And we felt empowered. What that to me was a gift that my father gave me.
Yeah, wow. I think you're right, and as you rightly say, we will get to this shortly, because you write so beautifully about your dad, in the book that you have written, and he does sound like he was an incredible force, behind everything that you have done, really, and
Yes.
I think you're
I
right. I
really
think
believe that.
having that sort of strong connection, because I suppose your parents lived through a time as well where your mum was a homemaker and worried a bit about what was going to happen, whereas your dad was like, no, you can do it, and off you go.
That's right. And I think the one thing I would say to any of your listeners today is, if they have children, and most of them probably do, I would have these conversations to actually empower them so they feel really confident in who and what they are, because they bounce off their parents. Their key role models are going to be their parental figures or their grandparents or some close relative. So in the way that you raise a child and an adult is just so important to their sense of self-worth and their sense of who they are. So I know we'll again come back to that later, but I really can't stress that enough.
Oh, that is some beautiful advice there. I have
Mm.
raised 3 children, and you never stop being their parent and trying to encourage them to believe that they can follow their dreams and believe that they can do all the things that they want to do, even if no one else quite understands it. Um, and I agree with you. I think that really giving them the courage to catapult themselves is so important. Absolutely.
Yes. And I think especially now because the world's so uncertain and, Gen Z, and they're just sitting there looking at the world thinking, what am I going to inherit? And I actually, I mean, back when I was growing up, it was not nearly, we weren't looking at climate change in the way that we were. We weren't looking at war in Ukraine, which can easily spread. We weren't looking at an economic climate that's just so dire in so many ways. And hopefully we're going to turn that around, shortly in Australia. I don't know. But I just think for them, it's so much harder than it was for us. And that's what that then means that as a parent or as a parental figure, it's even more critical what you say to your children now.
Yeah, that is so true. And it's interesting because, over the years, I think over generations, especially, in Australia and elsewhere, is that people always wanted things to be easier for their children. And we're looking, I think, for the first time, generations of kids growing up in a world that is more uncertain than it's ever been before.
That's right. And I think if you can teach your kids resilience is one of the things that's the most important thing that kids can take away. And yourself with your three kids, it's about, making them feel that anything's possible and also that they can achieve, because also how are they going to afford a house when they, if they're leaving school? I mean, it's almost impossible to get into the housing market. All these things play on their minds. And, and I really feel for a lot of young people what their future's going to be like.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the other important thing with kids in this sort of uncertain, as you said, in building resilience is to allow them to fail as well
Yes.
and to kind of go, that is not the end of the world. What have you learnt in the falling down? The most important thing is that you keep standing up, you know?
Yes, and I think you're right. Failure to me has always been one of the most instructive things in my career. And God, we've all failed. I mean, what I've always believed in is taking calculated risks, and sometimes they pay off, and sometimes they don't. And if I have failed in that calculated risk, at least I took it. All things considered, and I think that's really important as well. So you're absolutely right about teaching people that failure is as important as success because it's what you learn from that failure and take it into the next part of your life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that you're right. It's such a huge learning curve. And I think, unfortunately, if we, surround, our children in bubble wrap, if you like, and kind of say, oh, I don't want anything terrible to happen. Or, you make them fearful of the failure as well. But I think in failing, we learn such, but I know I failed a lot and I know I've learned valuable lessons from it. Right. So I think that that is important as well to allow space for that and allow space for
Yes.
them to stand up again without shame.
That's right. And look, I mean, I had this, and I think you probably know about this. I had this experience where I was working for the Nine Network many years ago. Now, I better preface this by saying the Nine Network is different today than it was back in the 1980s. So I'm talking about the 1980s. I was working as the 2IC on the Today Show. So all your listeners will know the Today Show now. In my day, it was hosted by George Negus and Liz Hayes, who were, fantastic to work with. So I was the 2IC, but in those days, Nine had never had an executive producer who was a woman, never, across any of their programs, whether it was news, current affairs, or any other programs that they had produced. So not once, not twice, but three times I put my hand up to be the executive producer when each of the executive producers had left. And each time I was actually turned down. I was too young and I was a female. Now, Liz Hayes actually went in and spoke to the then head of news and current affairs and said, well, Anita's doing the job. There's no reason why she shouldn't do that. And three times I got passed over for a male who didn't have the experience that I had. So I viewed that as a failure. And so what I did was I went home and I talked to my parents, and particularly my father. And he said to me, well, look, if you don't like that, you've only got one choice of action, is to resign. Now, I didn't have a mortgage and I didn't have children. So those two, packing those two things aside. But what I did have was I had the belief that I should have been doing that job. So I did go in and resign the next day because I felt I'd failed. I would never get that top job. And what happened was within a day or so, I was called up to the person that I'd resigned to, a male figure who was very prominent at Nine Network, and, And there, sitting on his desk, was a contract for me for 2 years on the biggest show on the network, which was 60 Minutes. So I turned a failure, or what I perceived into failure, into an opportunity. And then my career really took off because I was able to go to 60 Minutes when it was the biggest show on television, when it had the kind of, great reporters. We were traveling the world, we were telling great stories. So what a great opportunity that was for me. But I wasn't afraid to confront failure and turn that into an opportunity.
Yeah, and really interestingly, it's funny what we perceive to be failure as well. So what you then perceived to be failure was actually maybe the failure of heads of a network who didn't recognize
Yes.
the extraordinary talent that they had standing right in front of them. And as you say,
Well, not
because
just
you,
me, not just
yes,
me. There were other women there. There were other women there who were kind of in lowly production roles, and they were never getting the opportunity to actually use their skills and see that they had a career path. So yes, while I took that, jump and I took that risk, other women were able to, actually it kind of benefited other women in the longer term because they actually got to be executive producers eventually, a long time down the track, and that was in the 1990s, not in the 1980s or 70s or
wow.
60s or when television started in 1956. That was, and I'm not talking about the ABC because I think the ABC recognised women's skills, like through Caroline Jones and other very prominent women, a lot earlier than commercial networks did.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because I did mention this to you before, but I've had like a wonderful chat with Tracy Spicer on this podcast where we talked about being a woman in media
Yeah,
and how although things have changed quite a lot, there is still a long, long way to go for women in media. And one of the
yeah,
things that I'm quite passionate about, and I wanted to talk to you about because you've lived this and you've seen it through so long, I guess. Through lived experience, but is really talking about women in media and how difficult it still is in terms of the ratio between men and women. But also, I wanted to talk about ageism, basically in media,
mm, mm.
and how you feel about that.
So I'll start with women in media generally. I do think there are many more young women and women coming through the ranks across the media generally. I certainly see that in broadcasting, which is great. Um, what I don't see in broadcasting, and I'm focusing on the commercial networks here, is that we've only had one female CEO of a commercial network, and that was in the year 2000 on the Seven Network, a fabulous woman called Maureen Plasvik. So since Maureen Plasvik, we have not had another woman as a network CEO since her days in 2000 and 2001. Now, we're 20 years later. That has not changed. But I do think that there are opportunities for younger women and women generally coming through the ranks. But do I see them in CEO roles, that, penultimate? No, I don't. And I view that as well in newspapers and publishing because they really aren't the key decision makers right at the very top. And you can see that on boards as well. The boards that run those networks, their chairs are all men. They do have women on those boards. That's fantastic. But until we make that fundamental change of having women as the CEOs, you can't, as you said to me earlier, you can't be what you can't see. And that applies to our industry. And also because the media is so influential in the way that we consume content, the way we form our ideas, there is actually a lack of women reporting in terms of their bylines, particularly in sports. I'm co-chair of Women in Media here in Australia, and we did a recent gender scorecard research, and we found that 82% of bylines in terms of sport across the various, whether it's television, radio, or newspapers, are blokes. I do think ageism is a really, it's one of the isms that we rarely talk about. And I know you and I spoke about this briefly earlier, about ageism could affect a 20-year-old, when a 16-year-old gets a job that a 20-year-old. But equally, when you're in your late 40s, particularly your 50s, 60s, it is a real issue that we're having to grapple with. And I can't for the life of me understand why we don't have programs, mentoring programs, where we take all this wisdom and knowledge and use it. And I'm not talking about just media, I'm talking about cross industries. We've got this great cohort of people that have finished their careers nominally, and they're not being used, and all their knowledge is just wasted. So I think it's such a, I mean, if I was in government or leadership in that way, I always am about mentorship, because I think it's in empowering younger people and utilising older people to empower with their knowledge and their expertise. So you've just frozen
I
again.
couldn't agree more. I think, at the end of the day, this is something that I talk about a lot on this podcast with some pretty, I always feel like wisdom, as I said to you earlier, is hard won for women. No one hands it to us on a silver platter,
No.
and we earn that wisdom. We've got life experience, we have knowledge, and the things that we could be passing down to younger women coming
Yes.
through in every industry and basically just in life is so important. And I get continuously frustrated that wisdom isn't recognized enough.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, as I said earlier, I co-chair Women in Media. We're all about mentoring, getting industry leaders and, people who've really been, successful, not just successful, they've got the knowledge, and we pair them up with young people within the media sector and watch them blossom. And I can remember Andrew Denton and I did a show for the ABC called Elders, and we interviewed 12 people from around the world about the notion of wisdom. They were 65 and over. We had everybody from Dame Elizabeth Murdoch to Sir David Attenborough to Bob Hawke to Muhammad Yunus with the Grameen Bank. And you know what was so interesting? We went out and we went in search of wisdom and what these people had learned in their lives. And what was super interesting was it went to air on the ABC, and the ABC's audience tends to skew older. But when Elders went on air, the number of young people that found that show, and it was so popular and you could see it in ratings, spoke volumes to me about how important mentoring is and the harnessing of wisdom.
Wow, incredible. And you won an award for that. So that I have seen Elders, by the way, but what I did when I was doing some research about you is I discovered that you actually won an award for that, and it's actually an award that I didn't know existed, which is older people. Is that right?
Yeah, the Older People's Network. That's right. We actually, the
Yes.
program, Enough Rope, won and Elders won a number of, they were called OPSO awards. I'm sorry, I don't even know if they exist today. But yes, we won quite a number of those, because even on Enough Rope, we would always make sure that we weren't ageist, that it was actually, if somebody had an interesting and compelling story, didn't matter about fame, that wasn't the driver. It was actually that somebody had a story that was worthy of all of us hearing. And often they were older people, because older people have had such rich life experiences that we can all learn from them.
I love that. And I have seen that the lovely Noni Hazelhurst is actually co-hosting a show that's coming up on SBS, I saw, and she's actually co-hosting an episode about ageism
Yes,
and
yeah.
what Australia really thinks.
Well, I think Noni and Jane Jane Caro particularly is very strong on ageism, and I think Noni feels exactly the same way. That it's the great issue that we just do not discuss and we don't address, and it's always permeating through every organisation. And if you think about it, it really needs to be addressed. And I feel quite passionately about this, because we all should have a voice at the table, and we should all admire and respect experience and knowledge and learn from that.
Preaching to the converted here, because as you know, I started sort of a platform later in life. I'm in my 50s, because I got really frustrated by exactly that the amount of amazing, incredible, dynamic women that I have met in my life, continue to meet in my life, who sadly said to me, I feel like I'm invisible. I feel like no one's listening to me at work or at home or wherever they may be, or women really fighting, as you say, to have that chair at the table. was kind of really frustrating. And I was thinking, why isn't that reflected back to us? Why aren't we seeing all these dynamic, amazing women, um, doing incredible things? And it is because basically there is ageism, and it's rooted, I mean, Jane Carroll will say this, rooted a lot in, the patriarchy, but it's societal as well.
It
It
is
is
societal.
societal.
Absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And look, I applaud what you're doing with this podcast, because it is basically to actually break down those barriers and allow us all to feel really worthy, and that we do have something to contribute in life. And look, I do a lot of not-for-profit stuff, taking my comm skills and my media skills and all the rest of it, because I just think at the end of the day, that's experience that I've got, and I can use it. Even though you're not being paid, which to me is not the reason I'm doing it. It's because I have that experience and knowledge, and why wouldn't I share it? And why wouldn't I try and make a difference with that experience and with that knowledge? And there must be, lots of people listening to this who have that, experience, and it might be different experience to mine and different, knowledge, but that doesn't make it any less worthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually, like, listening to you then, something else occurs to me as well. Another thing that I talk about all the time is this ridiculous narrative that women are constantly competing with one another.
Yeah.
And yet, my experience of my platform and this podcast and talking to so many extraordinary women is quite the opposite has occurred in my lived experience
Mm.
of when you shout out for advice, for mentorship, for help, when whatever it may be, if you ask a woman, they tend to just stand up and say, yes, I can help you with that, or I can point you in the right direction, or have you spoken to this person? And women will absolutely shout out to other women, and you've already been doing that in this podcast.
Mm.
I love that. So what's been your experience of that?
So I think I said earlier, I've really only had, I had Ita as a mentor, and I'm now the chair of the ABC Advisory Council. So we're back working together after many, many years. But I've had very few female mentors, because I grew up in an industry that was predominantly men running it. But what I've learned is, in all the places that I've worked, whether when I worked with Andrew Denton or when I was running ITV, or I've always employed a lot of women, not to the exclusion of men. I've usually employed the best people for the job, and in a lot of cases that's been women. And we've built into the way that we employ them the capacity to have flexible working hours. So if they've got, young children, they can marry their career plus with actually raising a family and being a very effective parent, and a very available parent. But what I've always done is mentored people. I've just felt it was really important to impart some of the knowledge. And also, mentoring is not just imparting knowledge and experience, it's actually opening the doors for others and creating opportunities for them. So it's one thing to, say, yes, I'm going to help you. But I think it's as a mentor, what you're also doing is looking for opportunities for that person that you're mentoring and opening the door for them. But I've got to say, Sandy, in saying all of this, I've also, on occasion, encountered women who aren't generous and who don't open doors, and who in fact shut doors, or trap doors as I call it, and don't take women up into their realm. And I guess that's been particularly obvious to me in the media sector.
Yeah, and I think that you're right, and I'm sure that is prevalent through a lot of industries. But I think I'm loving this change of narrative that seems to be going on as well, where women are starting to shout out other women and starting to, as you say, open doors for them. And that yesterday I was at an International Women's Day event, and the whole thing that got talked about was collaboration over competition.
Yeah.
And so breaking down that narrative that women won't help each other, I think is really important, because when we start to break it down, then we start to act like that as well. We start to say, well, who can I shout out to in a room full of, who can I mention in a room full of people that I admire?
I think there's one area that I do think there's still work to be done, and I think that's on boards, because often when you get into your 50s and 60s and your career is kind of, tailing off, And then you think, well, how am I going to, what's my reinvention? What's my next step? What's my next chapter? And often, we go off and do the company directors course, that 5-day course, and we decide what we want to do is take our skills in other ways and utilize them, which is certainly what I've done. But what I do notice is in the top echelon of those, top ASX 200, it's usually a very particular type of woman that is kind of, and that's often a relationship between the chair, who's usually a bloke, and that woman. I do think some of those women need to take more women and encourage more women into that level, because I think there are a lot of women who deserve to be on those boards that aren't getting there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I agree. I agree, and I think that I've spoken to a lot of women who are on boards, but as you say, that those boards are predominantly weighted with male energy and male wisdom in the room, and there is far more room at the table for women for sure, and a lot more work to be done. We know that.
Yeah,
We could talk about this infinitum. I
yeah,
think
I know,
one of the things
I know. We just bring a different sensibility to any discussion, whatever it is. Look, I always think, I go back to the old Gruen days when Andrew and I were producing that. I mean, that 75% of consumer purchases are by women. So we understand the psychology of women. So it makes really good business sense to have us sitting more in that senior management role as CEOs and then on boards, because boards influence culture and strategy and all the rest of it. So on all levels, we should be at the table very effectively.
Yep, I agree. I think we see the world through a very, very different lens,
I know,
and
I know, I know you and I are in sync on this. So I know this. I know this from your podcast.
oh, thank you. But I also will say that you've got that lived experience of being on those boards, of having that seat at the table. And so I think the wisdom that you bring today and that you're talking about, this is first-hand lived experience. And I think that's so vital for people to be hearing that message. You are on those boards and trying to make a difference. And yet, as you so rightly say, there's so much more room at the table for more women.
Though I'm not on an ASX 200 board, and I'm saying this for all women who believe that they would really contribute, and I'm not just, but I'm saying this because we come with such different thinking that really, and it doesn't matter if you're not a lawyer or an accountant or the traditional ways that you get onto boards, because actually the skills of today, you can find an accountant to do that and a lawyer. And what women are traditionally is we're really quite empathetic. For whatever reason, we have a great understanding of risk because we know how to juggle a lot of things. Most of us do our homework and research, so we read board papers. And a lot of us have very inquiring minds. So we ask very left of field questions because we kind of figure there's something that doesn't quite add up or doesn't pass the sniff test or whatever it is. So we just have a different sensibility entirely, or usually do.
So yeah, I know, I agree. I think it's so very
Yeah.
true. I mean, and that's the beauty of having a mixed board, I guess, is that obviously, we look at things so differently. But I think you're right. We do have inquiring minds,
We do.
and we might think about stuff that the men at the table might not even have thought about. So it's quite important.
Yes.
I know that time is getting away from us, and I really, really want to talk about your incredible book. Wow, I mean, it's pretty amazing.
Can I say thank you for reading it? Honestly, I've just as an author, as a first-time author, I now have absolute renewed respect for anybody who's written a book. Anybody. It's the hardest thing that you'll ever do.
Yep, I have, and it's called Secrets Beyond the Screen. I was enamored by the whole idea of finding out things about a parent. And I don't want to give too much away about the book because I would really love people to go out, and I will put links. I would really love people to go out and read this book because I found it quite powerful. It's fair to say that you had quite a beautiful relationship with your dad growing up and throughout his whole life.
So my father fled Nazi Germany. and he fled to Australia. And he'd had his life before he fled Nazi Germany was one of, I think it's hard for us to understand because we live in, 21st century Australia, and actually we're all really lucky that we're living in this part of the world. But he grew up, at the First World War. He was a young child in the First World War. I mean, he was there for the Spanish pandemic when 20 to 50 million people died. He saw the rise of Nazism with Hitler. His family lost everything in the Great Depression in October, 1929. And then he finds out that he's Jewish and he has Jewish heritage, and he is jailed by the Nazis. And then he manages somehow to flee from Germany to the farthest country on the other side of the world with nothing and start again. And so I used to spend an inordinate amount of time with him in his study, talking about the world and world events and, from a very young age. So I thought I knew about his life, but I actually knew very, very little about his life. And now 25 years after he passed away, I have all these regrets that I can never speak to him about anything that I've learnt about him. And that's really hard. That's hard for anybody.
Yeah, wow. And you write about this in the book, but in seeking knowledge about your dad beyond him passing away, and and I've said this to you previously, but I am so sorry about that. And I know as somebody who has lost both parents, it is very, very, it's a difficult time. But you did this extraordinary thing where someone mentioned something about your dad. It piqued enough curiosity in you that you thought, oh, I didn't know about that, and I'm going to go and find out more about my dad. First of all, what an extraordinary thing to do.
Well, I've spent my lifetime telling hundreds of stories, all around the world, whether it's, I don't know, Bill Clinton, David Attenborough, Jane Fonda, Princess Diana's brother, you name them. Only to, in 2013, so 9 years ago, go to a family dinner party in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. It was a table, long oak table, lots of lawyers and journalists. We were shooting the breeze on a big triple murder case in Sydney. And all of a sudden, this barrister looks at me and he says, do you know about the infamous court case in the 1950s, way before I was born, involving your father? And if you're a journalist or a daughter who loves their parent and somebody says like that and you have no idea what they're talking about, from the moment I heard this, I was completely intrigued. Every bone in my body wanted to find out more of what was this court case? What was this lawyer telling me about? What could I find out? So I was driven, even though I was running ITV Studios, which was a massive company here in Australia, I was driven to find out more about this court case. I couldn't let it go.
Wow. And I will say, and please everybody go out and read this incredible book, because what was most profound to me was that you found out quite a lot about your dad and things, not just the court case, which is quite extraordinary in and of itself, but you found out quite a number of things about your dad that you had no idea about, and all the circumstances of certain things that you had no idea about. And as you say, you strike me as someone who probably couldn't have let it go. So you used the tools, I guess, that you had at your disposal. So, you had research skills at your disposal and you had friends who were researchers. So tell me about that journey of beginning that process of looking into your dad, I guess, and finding out things about your dad.
Well, what I did initially after I heard about this court case, the lawyer also told me that it involved a former Olympian who'd won double gold at Rome and who was friends with the Queen and given the horse to the Queen. And so I was so completely intrigued. Originally I thought, because I didn't know anything about the court case, I thought that somehow I must have been related to this double Olympian. And so I started researching that. And then because I was running this big company, what I did was, as you quite rightly say, I went out and I employed one of the best investigative journalists in the country who'd worked on Four Corners, a woman called Shaun Hoyt. And I said, look, I've heard about this court case. I'm desperate to find out, what is the court case? What is all this information? And so I brought her on board, and she helped me over about 3 years. It took us 3 years to find the original transcripts of the court case from the 1950s. That's from 1952-53, as I said, way before I was born. But she also went on to the public records. And because my father had fled Nazi Germany, and because he had been interned during the war here in Australia and treated appallingly by the Australian authorities, because he was too Jewish to safely remain in Germany, but not Jewish enough to be safe here in Australia. So he was jailed during part of the war. So a lot of what I found, and what Shaun helped me find, was on the public record in his own words in the National Archives. So I am sure there are lots of us, and those people listening today, who might know stuff about their relatives, who might be absolutely shocked what you can find on the public record if you go looking.
Yeah, wow. Quite extraordinary. And it's fair to say, well, I'm reading this book, and my impression was that you had this quite lovely childhood, with your brother, and you do have another sister, and which was from your dad's previous marriage.
Yes.
But you had this kind of really lovely childhood growing up in Sydney, and a dad, as you rightly pointed out before, that you go and talk to about anything and have these extraordinary conversations about world events in his study. And just even the way that you write about that is so poetic and so beautiful that you can almost envisage it.
Thank you.
I felt like I was almost sitting in that study with you, which is quite lovely.
You know what, Sandy? I was just going to say, I think I was lucky because I had, both of my parents were political refugees, which meant that they both fled their countries. My mother was born in Harbin in northern China, in Manchuria. They fled when the Japanese invaded, or not long after that. And my father fled Nazi Germany. So they arrived with nothing to Australia. But my father was very successful in business, and he gave my brother and myself all the opportunities, as did my mother, that they never had. And this is what refugees, political refugees and migrants bring to our country that we really don't appreciate. They bring all their capacity to see opportunity in our country and give that to their children.
Yeah, and an absolute determination to build and rebuild life, their lives, right? And I think that, that they bring so much wisdom, as you say, to our country. But, I for one, like, my mum grew up in Carlton here in Melbourne, and it was predominantly an area where, migrants and political refugees were living, people who were a huge Jewish community who had fled, Germany during the Nazi regime, and who were there. But, my mum used to always say, thank goodness for everybody who came to this country, for their food, for their fashion, for their passion for life, for all the things that we take for granted now as a whole country that we didn't have here.
Yes, and it's interesting. My mother, she worked in after the Second World War, and she was very young. She would travel around New South Wales talking about how important multiculturalism was and assimilation. That's what it was really called, assimilation in those days, how important it was, because she spoke, 3 languages. She was a white Russian, but she spoke Russian, Czech, and 4 languages, Polish and English. And what she used to always say throughout her life, she would say to whoever was listening, we're all just people. And so whenever I see people from different nationalities, I actually don't really see race. I just see people. And I think that's kind of what Australia's about. We're the second most multicultural country in the world. I think Canada maybe just peaks us. And how lucky are we to grow up with parents like that have come from other countries and who actually have looked after us and given us all the opportunities, but also where you get a bit of culture and understanding that the world's actually a fabulous place. It's not just about Australia. There's so much we can bring from internationally into our country. which makes us richer. And I don't mean money-wise, I just make us richer as people.
Absolutely. I'm very lucky, I think, to have been raised like, around a lot of extraordinary food, which of course was, Carlton was, Greek, Italian, all of those things. And
Yeah.
I'm very, very grateful because my love of food definitely came from my mum growing up in that area, my grandmother continuing to live in that area until she passed away. So quite extraordinary. But so I do love that they brought that kind of that idealism with them, that they wanted to build a better life and give that to their children. And it's, you are lucky, absolutely, but you went on and you took that gift and you ran with it and you created an extraordinary life for yourself. So, that's on you as well, which is fantastic.
But
Um,
again, that just shows how powerful those role models of parents are.
yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And I do love that your mum, you write about this in the book, that your mum was going around, as you say, talking about multiculturalism and how important it is to a country, and your dad encouraged that. And I think you had like a powerful role model in that as well. So your dad's a powerful role model, but so is your mum.
Yes, she was. And I've got to say, after the Second World War, as most people probably know, there was not a lot of, we were very monocultural, we were very white, so actually encouraging all these communities, these international communities, to come into Australia was not embraced in those days. So it was really important that Australians understood what this would mean for us. When you go, today we're very, very, as we talked about, very multicultural. Those days we weren't at all. We were actually we were quite racist. And we're probably still racist to a degree, but not nearly as badly as post the Second World War.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you and I are very blessed in that we live in very multicultural cities. So
Mm.
both Melbourne and you're in Sydney are. And I know there are certain places around Australia that perhaps don't have the richness of that multiculturalism. But you're right. I think things have definitely improved. We have obviously a very long way to go, but things have definitely improved on that
Yes,
front.
yes.
So I'm fascinated by you hire Sean, and she's incredible, and she's investigating, if you like, your dad, which
Yep.
must have been a little bit surreal in some ways, because he's not just a subject, he's
No.
actually your parent.
Yes, and look, that's a really good point. I originally set out to just write a family history, to find out about this court case and to write about a family history. But the more that Sean dug, and I did too, and the more we found out, the more compelling it was. And I had this incredible wrestle over many years about, do I write a story just for the family, or do I write a story for a wider consumption? Because I recognise as a journalist, as a producer, as a storyteller, that I'd discovered a story that I felt was really important to tell. But that was a wrestle over many years. And finally, I decided that I would share it with a wider audience. But that doesn't mean I found it very hard, because I did. Because I also had to show vulnerability, which, growing up in commercial television, trust me, we don't do vulnerability well. And it's not that you're not vulnerable, it's just that you don't show it.
Yeah, wow. So I think that the really interesting thing that I want to talk about, like that I'm fascinated about, is that who I guess the man that raised you is your dad, and these discoveries that you make about your dad. Because the interesting part for all of us is our parents are actually human beings outside of being a parent.
Yes.
Um, they have a life before you, and they have a life after us as well. But how did you reconcile this kind of persona, this person that you very much love and have on a pedestal, and rightly so as a parent, to this person that you discover all these things about your dad that you never saw that side of him when he was raising you? And how did you reconcile that? How do you process that information?
Look, it's really difficult. As I said, I could never speak to him about anything that I was learning along the way, because he was long gone. So I felt, I wrestled with it, on many levels, because I was finding out a lot about both his, not just his professional life, but his personal life. And his personal life was marred by incredible tragedy. Uh, on a number of occasions, the sort of tragedy that is kind of gobsmacking. And so I was wrestling with how much I felt a pain for him as to what I was discovering and what his life had had. And I also then was able to recognise there always had been a sort of an inner anger and a bit of depression that I had seen in him, but I'd not been able to understand it. And now I've got a much clearer understanding about what would have been some of the factors that led to the depression and this, that sense of anger that I would occasionally see. And the saddest thing is, I now see a man who is much more complex, much more flawed than my idealized version of him. But I still love him, and I will always love him because he's my father. But it doesn't mean that I don't see him with all his complexities, and I appreciate him more. As I said, my great regret is I would love to sit down. I have a million questions that I would want to ask him, but I will never get that opportunity in this life to do so. That's hard to grapple with on any level.
Yeah, and that I think was the thing that struck me most about the book was how many families, families are complex. Families are always complex. And I remember someone said to me many years ago, all families have skeletons in the closet and all families are a little bit dysfunctional. It's just to what degree.
That's
And
right. That's
right.
exactly right.
And right. And but I always think, and I have, complexities in my family as well, that, yeah, it's just fascinating. But my mum passed away without telling me certain things about my life, and then me discovering things later, and it's quite extraordinary. I wonder how many families are out there where this is their truth, is that they will never know the full truth because we were robbed of the opportunity in a way to discuss things that we find out later.
I think, Sandy, that's absolutely many, many, many families. They don't. I think we're very mechanical in some of our relationships, certainly with our parents. They take us to piano lessons and ballet, but we don't recognise, as you say, that they had a life before we came on the scene. And we actually don't spend the time while they're alive to find out about their life. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how many funerals I've gone to, not just with family and close friends, but work colleagues and everything. And I learned something, or more than one thing, that I had no idea about them. Somebody that I worked with who was a champion swimmer, I had no idea. Somebody who I worked with was a spy during the war, or, all of those things we don't know about until it's too late. And I think that's a great tragedy. And family to me is the most fascinating thing in our lives. As I said, I've told so many stories, but the stories of our families and who and what we are is the most fascinating because it's most closely related to and what we are. And it tells us so much about who and what we are. I now have far deeper understanding of myself through my father's life. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. I think it's a good thing. But, maybe there are things that people find out that they don't want to know about. But I just think, if you can, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, I know for a fact my mother was a deeply complex and very, very layered human being. It's funny that as I've gotten older and wiser, that I look back on some of that complexity and where it came from, and the experiences in her life that forged who she would become, that I have a greater understanding because I'm older and wiser, if that makes sense. So as a kid, we can't understand any of that or see
No.
any of that. But as you get older and you've lived then your own trauma and your own life experience and your own, whatever it may be, your ups and downs, your failures, your successes, that you get a better understanding of your parents, I think, or a better acceptance perhaps of your
Yeah.
parents.
Yeah. I now know, I now know a lot more about my mother. I never had a really good relationship with her. I found her, it just wasn't a warm, mother-daughter, best friendy kind of relationship. But now, having researched some of her background, I understand why she was such a complex woman. And I had no understanding of that while she was alive. I had no understanding that where she grew up in Harbin, the Japanese were conducting some of the most incredible and appalling experiments. And they were just, she and her parents and her younger brother were just managing to survive under the most appalling circumstances. And it's not like they moved to another country and they shut off their past. What they do is they try and block it, and they try and move on to another life. But all those early influences shape exactly who they are. So I now have a far better understanding of both of my parents. And I'm grateful that I do.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's the more you find out about a parent, I think, yes, it gives you a better understanding of where they came from, how difficult life was at times for other generations.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, yes, it does get easier. And in some, we were talking about the younger generation coming up and how things are more difficult in some ways, but that generation hasn't lived through depression and war and some extraordinary things that your parents both lived through.
Mm.
And when your parents came together, of course, they're bringing their own traumas, their own baggage, their own lived experience together as well, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and I realise now very clearly with political refugees, often migrants, they're all about moving forward. They're looking for opportunity. They've come to a new country and they want to create opportunity. They're not often reflecting on the past. The past is there, and there's a line in the sand drawn, and they're all about that future. And for the children of migrants, that's often a really exciting opportunity for them, and it's a gift for them.
It is such a gift. I, for one, am so thrilled that you wrote this book. I
Oh,
think
thank you, Sandy.
such a personal journey for you, but I'm sure it will resonate with so many people because it is delving into what are the things we don't know, but also too, it is a real lesson for me, particularly as a parent, and I'm sure for a lot of people to sort of say, what is it about my life that my kids really don't know? Because there are
Mhm.
certain things we just choose not to discuss with our kids.
Yeah. And look, I mean, it's not that you've got to, probably do as big a deep dive as I did into my father's history and discover these extraordinary stories. I'm not sure that most parents have the kind of background that he did. Um, and I can laugh about it now, but I was just a bit gobsmacked when I was going through the process. Or laugh. I can appreciate it, now. But I just really feel that, you do want to find out what are those forces that have shaped you? Why are you the way you are? Why do you react in the way you do to whatever it is? And I think, then you've got a better understanding of you, and you can pass that on to your children. Your partner understands you better, your relatives understand, and you understand yourself better. And you recognize your weaknesses more as well. So
There's
it's
that
been one hell of a
vulnerability again,
journey is all I
Anita.
can say. And I can tell you I'm not writing another one.
Well, look, I would imagine, I'm sure that was such. I mean, how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, from the going to the dinner party to when it was published, it was 9 years. So I had
Wow.
multiple drafts, as I said, because I just didn't want to. I didn't want it for public consumption, and I also didn't want to inject any of my story in there. Not that it's an autobiography, but I was convinced that I had to put some of my story in, so readers would come along and understand the voice, the person that was writing that story. So I wrestled with that for years because I'm all about telling everybody else's story, not my own. Just
I'm really pleased that you chose to put yourself in the story, that it wasn't
oh,
just
thank you.
about
Well,
your dad Philip. It wasn't just about Philip. It was about, it really was on some level this extraordinary relationship between a father and a daughter. And I so appreciated that. And I thank you for your bravery in sharing your dad's story, because it is one hell of a story for those. As I said, I don't want to give it all away, but people should rush out and
yeah.
read this book. But there's a lot of intrigue. There's intrigue about, things that happened when he got to Australia, with the war movement, just a lot of things, a lot of women and a lot of marriages and a lot of things. And
And a lot of
it's
history. I
a
hope you
lot
feel
of
that there's
history.
a lot of Australian history that we don't traditionally read about during the war and post-war, what Australia was really like. And I really tried to
Absolutely.
develop that to paint a picture of, to show what we as a country were like at that time, which we're quite different now.
And I found that really fascinating. So, you can see, you're an extraordinary writer, but you can see your passion for research in this as well. And absolutely, I think I was, reading parts of the book and seeing that and actually thinking, oh, that's what my mum would have been thinking, or that's what my grandmother, to be honest, would
Yeah,
have been,
yes.
living at that time. Yeah, so quite fascinating. It is a beautifully written book. It's a powerful story about, yes, your relationship with your dad, but also a powerful story about uncovering um, a person who, humanizing your dad beyond his role as a parent, and sharing some of his history. I'm sure there would be even more of it, but sharing some of his history and his story and how
Mm.
powerful that is.
Thank you. Well, look, I feel like there are some universal themes in there that would resonate with anybody who's been a child, which is all of us. And so I hope that's what readers will take away from it, that they just provokes them to think and to ask and to question and to research and to find out more. If they feel that they want to. I mean, it's just, I found it very, overall, even though it took me 9 years, I found it very rewarding in the end. And I do feel on a personal level that I'm really glad. Glad's a naff word. I feel like it was the right thing to do. And can I say also, I wanted to celebrate a refugee's success story, because we don't often do that.
We don't. And actually, I want to link back to that just for a minute, because your dad was really involved in, importing electrical goods, which is really important in that. Your dad worked for Sony when colour television came into Australia,
Yeah.
which is, incredible. He was a representative. Is that, what's the right terminology? But he was basically wholesaling Sony products. Is that right?
Well, he brought Sony into Australia, but he'd also
Perfect.
built
Yeah,
up a
beautiful.
company again that was on the stock exchange, which, to build
Love
up a
it.
company that's listed on the stock exchange and then subsequently sold, is for anybody, that's a real achievement. And I think it was in the pre-social media days where people didn't know, didn't kind of really appreciate those success stories, where we understand that more these days.
Absolutely. And I loved that story though, of because that your dad was in that line of work, he was in that business, that you had a color television when color television came in. How exciting. And it struck me that how interesting that you would be so enamored by that years later you would end up working in television. So that part
Yes.
wasn't actually lost on me.
No, and hence the title "Secrets Beyond the Screen." The screen being that my father, brought Sony to Australia and was, very influential in that area. And I worked in television, and here I am, I never connected the dots until I started writing this book. How dumb am I? Really?
It's kind of really magical when you think about it. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's where you would probably just say, "Oh yeah, television." Like that seems like a logical thing for me to do.
yeah.
Yeah, quite extraordinary, and I do love that, and I love your the entrepreneurial spirit of your dad. And yeah, I think it's just extraordinary. This is such a beautiful book, Secrets Beyond the Screen. And as I said, I will put up all the links across our socials and in our show notes about where people can find this book, because anyone who has a parent where you think, oh, I never really, I didn't have a chance to ask them questions, or I didn't think to ask them questions and now it's too late. It's such a powerful book, and one also which is a reminder to all of us that it's never too late to start asking questions and start delving into the lives of the people that you love, because it's quite difficult, and I'm in the same boat. When they're gone, you can't ask those questions.
No, I know, Sandy. Look, I totally agree. And I just think often we're a bit selfish in the way we lead our lives. And then, as I said earlier, when you get to somebody's funeral, that's when you're really finding out about this extraordinary life that you've missed.
Yeah.
And we've all got stories. I mean, that Enough Rope, when we were running Enough Rope, our slogan was, "Everybody has a story," and that's true. We've all got a story. You've just got to ask and be interested and do a bit of digging and find out. So I think it's. Do I feel like I've been part of the Good Girl Confessional? I certainly feel like it.
I feel 100% humbled and honoured that you are a part of the Good Girl
Thank
Confessional, and
you.
you're certainly
Oh,
part of the tribe now.
thank you, Sandy. Well, look, I've really enjoyed it. You and I could probably go on for hours, but I don't think your listeners will want to hear too much more.
I feel like we could almost come back later for a part two. There's so
Yeah,
much in
there
your
is.
career and your story that I didn't get to that I would love to talk to you about at some point. And look, I think you are extraordinary. I thank you for your bravery in writing this book. I think, and it is brave. I think it's brave for anyone to share of themselves and their story and then share their family history, and especially in writing this story, sharing your father's story is really powerful. So I thank you for that. But also I want to thank you as a woman for everything that you have done for the media, for in television, in print, honestly, being a part of the Australian Film Industry Board, but doing all amazing things and representing as a woman. I think you're extraordinary, and I love everything that you do.
Oh, Sandy, thank you. I feel so chuffed to hear all of this. Thank you. Look, I've just been very fortunate, but I do really think that if an industry has, in spite of all the hurdles that I've had in the industry, if an industry has been good to you, you should put something back into the industry. And I also think if you've got skills that you can use in that not-for-profit area, I think it's really important that you do. I think too many of us are just kind of don't take those skills and use them in a really worthwhile way that makes you actually feel better about yourself as well. And there is life after, being a CEO. There's much more life, and forget ageism, just go out and do it. Whatever you want to do, embrace it and do it. And stuff the fact that you might be in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever age you are. I mean, I can never sit on my backside and not be doing something that I think is constructive and, yes, something that I'm proud of, or hopefully proud of. And thank you
Well,
for
you've
giving me the
certainly got a lot to be
opportunity,
proud
Sandy.
of.
Thank you. Much appreciated. And for anybody listening, if they belong to the media sector, please join Women in Media. We're growing. We've got over 6,000 members. We'd love to have you as one of our members. And yes, please do so.
Yes, well, I will certainly be joining up, and we will put in the links for that as well in the show notes and across our socials, so anyone listening along can find you and join up. And I'll be putting up links so people can follow your incredible journey, Anita, because you're still out there doing extraordinary things. So I know I'm a woman who is extraordinarily grateful to be able to meet you today and have a chat with you. I think you're brilliant.
Well, Sandy, thank you so much, and thank you to all your listeners for bearing with us to the end of this. And I wish you all the best in everything that you're doing. And I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine, available now at wb40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.